Welcome to History Nest where the past whispers you to sleep. The sound of marble breaking beneath the weight of gilded sculptures wakes you up. They are all sculpted in the image of a man who considers himself to be a deity. You are a senator in the Roman Empire in the year 39 AD, Emperor Gas standing in the Palatine Hills shadow for the offense of inadequate worship. Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, also known as Caligula, orders another execution. The thick aroma that clings to the purple silk that covers every surface of the imperial palace is mingled with the metallic smell of your fellow senators. Fearful perspiration in the morning air, watching the 23-year-old emperor caress the neck of his favorite horse in Satis, while jokingly debating which of your co-workers needs to perish next, causes your hands to quiver. If you love learning about the hidden facts of history, think about clicking the like button and subscribing for more content like this before delving into these lost tales of survival and pain. Additionally, kindly let me know where you're listening by leaving a comment below. It's amazing to me that we're studying these old tales from around the globe together, bound together by our mutual interest in the past and transcending time and location. Gas, with the hopes of an entire empire riding high. Caligula rose to power in the year 37 AD. He was raised in the midst of Roman troops on the Germanic frontier, where soldiers made small military boots for the boy they lovingly called Caligula. He was born in 12 AD to the adored General Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder. In order to survive his rule, the troops who had earlier bounced him on their knees little boots would subsequently mutter prayers. His first few months as emperor seemed bright. Caligula gave the Praetorian Guard and Roman civilians large bonuses, reinstated democratic elections, and released political prisoners. But somewhere between the poisoned murmurs of court flatterers and the marble corridors of total authority, the young man who had once enchanted legions started to change into something Rome had never seen before. An emperor who indulged in cravings that appalled even a culture used to extravagance, and who demanded worship as a living deity. The initial indications surfaced in 38 AD, when he was recuperating from an unexplained illness, his lips moving in quiet conversation with phantom partners. Palace servants saw how his eyes would stare at nothing for extended periods of time. Courtiers noticed that something fundamental had changed behind those pale blue eyes as he came out of his hospital bed. Where calculation had once been, there now burned an eerie blend of paranoia and divine grandiosity. The first indication of Caligula's metamorphosis was his attitude towards religious ritual, the cautious deception that they reigned with divine blessing rather than as gods themselves was upheld by traditional Roman emperors. With the zeal of a man who finds fire, Caligula broke this barrier. In order to update his divine appearance with the changing seasons, he ordered temples all around the empire to replace sculptures of traditional gods with representations of himself, complete with interchangeable heads. He built ornate shrines in his private residences where he would converse with statues of Venus, Mars, and Jupiter. Serfs reported hearing both sides of the conversation, as if holy spirits heard only by him were telling cosmic jokes about mortal affairs. The sound of their emperor's laughter blended with quiet, and guards outside his apartments became accustomed to it. Even the cynical aristocracy of Rome was scandalized by these theological innovations that penetrated into the private sphere. Senators and their spouses were forced to take part in rituals that conflated political subservience with sexual degrading behavior. As part of Caligula's cult of imperial adoration, in one recorded ceremony in 39 AD, he made Senator Marcus Junius Brutus's wife undress in front of a golden statue of him while he recited prayers usually offered for Venus, the goddess of sexuality and love. In methods that turned government into a theater of the ridiculous, the emperor's sexual desires became inextricably linked to his political authority. In order to attend palace meals, where their major purpose was presentation rather than conversation, he kept a revolving roster of married women from well-known families. These women, who were picked for their husband's political significance rather than their beauty, would be seated at Caligula's whim, sometimes forced to serve wine, and other times at his feet like dogs. All the while, their husbands feigned indifference to their wives' humiliation. Marcus Lepidus, who was married to Drusilla, Caligula's sister, was in the odd position of having to witness his emperor brother-in-law publicly caress his wife at state dinners while also talking about military battles and taxation. According to Roman historians, Lepidus would keep his gaze locked on whoever was discussing Germanic tribe movements or grain imports, his jaw muscles clenching like a man chewing leather as his wife, only a few feet away, screamed and groaned at the emperor's touch. There were several functions for Thesausuper performances in Caligula's mental environment. They simultaneously satisfied his seeming desire for an audience during his most private times and proved his full dominance over Rome's most influential families. The emperor, who turned every sexual relationship into a public display of imperial power, was incapable of enjoying pleasure without witnesses to his supremacy. Caligula had incestuous relationships with all three of his sisters Agrippina, Drusilla, and Julia Livilla, according to Roman sources, especially Suetonius and Cassius Dio. However, he saved his greatest devotion for Drusilla, who passed away in 38 AD, most likely from a fever, though some speculated that she may have been poisoned. Even a society accustomed to imperial excess was horrified by the ways in which Caligula's grief showed itself. He created a cult in Dacelationar, complete with temples and priests, and proclaimed her a goddess. However, he went far beyond conventional deification in his daily rituals. The emperor was reportedly discovered by palace servants in Drusilla's old rooms, having intricate discussions with her jewelry, clothes, and even cosmetics. As if she could hear and react, he would spend hours moving her possessions around and explaining his everyday routine to these inanimate objects. Reports of Caligula's encounters with Drusilla's body prior to her funeral were even more unsettling. Although they were written decades later, several sources asserted that the emperor held private ceremonies in her presence that blended aspects of religious ceremony with what can only be calidnecrophic worship, delaying her burial for days, according to reports. He treated her death as just another change in their relationship rather than its termination, anointing her corpse with pricey oils while spouting political schemes and love poetry. His treatment of his executed foes was part of these private rites with the deceased. When Caligula gave orders to kill political opponents, he often demanded personal participation in their last moments, which went well beyond the norm for executions. In order to combine sexual stimulation with the ultimate manifestation of imperial power, the right to kill, he would demand that condemned captives be taken to secret chambers where he could see and take part in their deaths while they were in various states of undress. In one well-known instance, Senator Gnaeus Po was charged with conspiracy. In the year 40 AD, Caligula ordered Peto taken to his private abathos instead of the customary execution or forced suicide that senatorial class members usually received. Wearing only gold jewelry and a wreath of laurel leaves, the emperor personally tormented Peto there amid the reverberating acoustics of marble walls and steam. Caligula would cycle between causing agony and enjoying himself, according to witnesses, as though the senator's anguish and his own arousal were parts of the same ritual. The emperor's treatment of gladiators and arena spectacles reflected his obsession with death as a personal experience. As Politia Caltheator, traditional emperors may attend gladiatorial contests to show off their dominance over life and death. Caligula turned these public displays into manifestations of his personal desires. During battle, he would command some gladiators to be taken to his private viewing box, where they would have to engage in combat while he masturbated just feet away, their perspiration and blood blending with his erotic ecstasy. His most well-known arena invention was the forced gladiatorial battle that humiliated Rome's noble women on a regular basis. These were senators' wives and daughters, forced to fight against professional opponents with spersimer that highlighted their frailty and bare flesh, in contrast to the professional female gladiators who occasionally competed in the arena. During these fights, Caligula would stand at the edge of the arena, close enough to hear their breathing and see the fear in their eyes as they faced skilled murderers. Extensive ceremony centered around the emperor's horse Insiditus were added to his collection of personal rights. Although Caligula's threat to turn his horse into a consul is remembered in history, his bond with the animal was actually much more complicated and unsettling. While Caligula spoke about their unending love, palace staff stated that the emperor and Insiditus regularly married, exchanging vows and hosting bridal feasts, where the horse was hand-fed delicacies. Caligula would usually perform sexual actions in front of the horse when these rituals came to an end. It seems that he thought Insata was a witness to his heavenly virility. Next to the horse's stable, the emperor built ornate bedchambers where he would spend the night snuggled up against the animal, talking about personal anxieties and state secrets that he believed to be humanly confidential. Examining Caligula's early trauma and the unachievable demands of imperial authority uncovers the psychological underpinnings of these actions. When Caligula was 7 years old, his father, Germanicus, passed away inexplicably. It is possible that enemies of Emperor Tiberius poisoned him. Young Gas was left to negotiate the perilous intrigues of the imperial court without family protection after his mother. Agrena, the elder, spent years in exile and was eventually imprisoned. Tiberius, a very unstable king who spent his last years in self-imposed exile on the island of Capri, reared Caligula after his parents passed away. The adolescent Caligula was surrounded by rumors of sexual perversion and cruelty, and it is possible that he witnessed and even took part in Tiberius's infamous abuse. One suck rumor was that the emperor enjoyed using children as sexual playthings during lavish dinner parties that combined systematic abuse with fine dining. Tiberius taught Caligula that ultimate power equated to complete freedom from moral restraints. According to Oromers, the elder emperor supported his heirs' growing appetites because he saw them as organic manifestations of imperial power. During this time, servants claimed to have seen adolescent Caligula rehearsing speeches while young. Slaves were tormented for his amusement, growing to associate authority with causing pain and seeing dehumanization. In addition to the extensive system of Roman governance, Caligula inherited a court culture that had normalized the link between sexual dominance and political power for decades. When he came to power at the age of 24, his inventions expanded on the groundwork established by his forebears, but they did so with a ferocity and inventiveness that implied true psychological force rather than merely political expediency. The most persistent window into Caligula's private mentality was his marriage to Sonia in 39 AD. His marriage to Sonia lasted until his assassination in 41 AD. In contrast to his 3 prior marriages, which had all been short-lived political agreements. Because of her lack of beauty and connections, historians have conjectured about the nature of their relationship. According to modern narratives, Sonia was remarkably eager to engage in and support Caligula's most severe actions. She allegedly contributed to the planning and execution of several humiliation rites performed on aristocratic families, proposing modifications and scenarios that would heighten the psychological toll on the victims, as well as the emperor's erotic pleasure. Khania would frequently be present during Caligula's torture sessions, providing support and commentary, according to palace servants. Instead of following the customary Roman wedding rites, the emperor's marriage ceremony created patterns that would characterize their relationship. Even though it included violence and sexual lilies, Caligula forced dozens of aristocratic families to participate in an elaborate show that lasted for days. Visitors were expected to observe both the ceremonial and the actual consummation of the union, which was performed on a platform set up in the main courtyard of the palace, while senators and their spouses stood in precisely planned circles and were not allowed to turn away. It seems that Sonia flourished in this setting of planned, degrading behavior and public sexuality. According to sources, she was an active participant rather than a victim who genuinely enjoyed using sexual humiliation to exert control over others. She frequently proposed new victims for their combined attention, pointing out women whose husbands had not been enthusiastic enough about the emperor's most recent demands, or men whose money made them desirable candidates for complex blackmail plots. Even the cynical watchers of the imperial court were appalled by the way their daughter, Julia Drusilla, who was born in 39 AD, became another part of Caligula's ritual life. The emperor would hold the nude infant while describing her future position as a goddess and his eternal companion at elaborate rite showering the infant's celestial nature. Usually, these rituals ended with Caligula having intercourse with his daughter, since he seemed to feel that her presence blessed and enhanced his celestial virility. In the royal nursery, palace workers reported discovering ornate shrines where Caligula would hold private worship sessions that fuses sexualized devotions to his young daughter's purported divine essence with customary prayers to Roman gods. He paid huge sums to sculptors to keep quiet about the precise nature of the statues he commissioned, which showed him and the infant in attitudes that even the sculptors were astonished to make. Additional facets of the emperor's mental landscape were shown by the way he treated masculine courtiers and slaves. His relationships with some men appear to satisfy different emotional needs than his interactions with women, which were on dominance and humiliation. He kept a changing group of young male slaves who were not only his sexual partners, but also confidants for his most irrational fantasies and grandiose delusions. These young men held a special place in Caligula's realm because they were usually bought as youngsters and trained especially for imperial service. They were both the most disposable people in the empire, subject to execution for even the smallest imagined treachery or for merely seeing too much of the emperor's weakness, and the most trusted, with access to state secrets and private confessions. Fragments of testimony left by Marcus, a young slave who worked under Caligula for almost 2 years before his recorded execution in 40 AD, were kept by palace workers. These narratives give us a glimpse of Caligula's innermost anxieties and obsessions: his fear of being assassinated, his belief that God spoke to him directly, his view that sexual conquest was the purest form of political control, and his developing suspicions about the loyalty of practically everyone in his immediate vicinity. According to Marcus's testimony, Caligula would have the young slave dress up as different Roman gods during elaborate midnight rites, while the emperor engaged in sexual practices and gave long monologues about his divine nature and cosmic duties. Caligula would alternate between passionate sexual encounters and meandering philosophical conversations about the nature of power, godhood, and mortality during these sessions, which occasionally lasted for hours. The emperor's ritualistic practices, which blended sexual activity with intricate protection ceremonies, were a manifestation of his concerns of dying. His most intimate moments would need to be shared with several partners. Evidently, he thought that others who saw how unfit he was would be able to prevent attempts at his murder. Everyone in the room was infected by the paranoid sexuality that pervaded the rooms where these sessions were held, which were encircled by armed guards and illuminated by dozens of oil lamps. Another aspect of his psychological demands was made clear by his interactions with the Praetorian Guard. Caligula frequently requested guardsmen to partake in his private rites. In contrast to earlier emperors who kept a formal distance from them, it seems that Caligula considered the guardsmen's physical security to be inextricably linked to their attendance during his sexual acts. Selected for their devotion and discretion, these men were forced to observe and occasionally take part in situations that tried even their professional composure. After spending months monitoring the emperor's private actions, Centurion Cassius Chaerea, who would later spearhead the plot that killed Caligula, came to the conclusion that assassination was the only way to end what he called the divine madness. In his subsequent testimony, he details the rituals in which Caligula would demand that guardsmen be alert as he performed sexual acts just feet away, their professional discipline preventing them from reacting to what they saw. In Caligula's mind, these displays had several functions. They showed his dominance over violently trained men, in addition to giving him a platform for his sexual displays. They established a network of corrupted witnesses who were obligated to his service by their shared shame and guilt, since their own cooperation left them open to punishment. The emperor realized that those who had witnessed him participate in behaviors they found reprehensible were unlikely to turn on him. Caligula's palace's spatial arrangement demonstrated his desire to balance his personal desires with his public power. In order to create a fluid space where political gatherings could easily turn into sexual exhibitions and back again, he commissioned substantial renovations that removed the usual borders between staterooms and private rooms during what they had anticipated to be standard diplomatic conversations. Visiting dignitaries may find themselves watching torture sessions, even though private meetings with the emperor can abruptly turn into discussions about military operations or trade agreements. These architectural advancements had uses beyond ease. It was impossible to predict whether senators attending political gatherings would be talking about taxes or witnessing their wives engage in dehumanizing behavior, maintaining a perpetual condition of fearful apprehension among Rome's elite, which improved the emperor's ability to regulate their conduct. Extensive stage scenarios that blended aspects of politics, drama, and sensuality were a manifestation of the emperor's passion for theatrical performance. As he watched and masturbated, he would have authors develop screenplays for scenarios involving particular senators and their families, then make them act out their designated roles. The intricate narratives of these hours-long performances, which included betrayal, humiliation, and reconciliation, were used as vehicles for the emperor's sexual gratification. According to Caligula's meticulous stage instructions, Senator Lucius Vitellius and his wife Plaucia had to execute a pre-written discourse about marital adultery, while gradually taking off their clothes and having sex, directing their performances, while enjoying himself and offering running feedback on their technique and emotional authenticity. The emperor took up his position at the center of the scene. Caligula's intricate knowledge of psychological manipulation was made evident by these theatrical plays. He seems to understand that coercing people into performing humiliating acts while claiming that their involvement was voluntary caused more severe psychological harm than merely physical coercion. He turned his victims from passive objects of torture into active contributors to their own degrading treatment by making them recite pre-written sentences, expressing excitement for their own humiliation. The way the emperor handled religious rituals shows how completely he had incorporated sexuality into all facets of imperial power. Ancient Roman religious rites placed a strong emphasis on communal involvement and group worship of recognized deities. By transforming these events into displays of his own celestial sexuality, Caligula made it necessary for attendees to adore him by performing actions that fused sexual service with religious devotion. Caligula commissioned the building of a vast temple complex for the festival of Saturnia in 40 AD, replacing customary religious rituals with devotional sessions focused on his sexual performance. In addition to participating in customary prayers and offerings, citizens were expected to attend these services and engage in ritualized acts of subjection, which included sexual acts carried out in the emperor's presence and under his close supervision. Caligula's apparent conviction that sexuality was the purest manifestation of heavenly power was mirrored in these religious developments. He appeared to believe that his power to force others to have sex proved that he had divine control over the most private facets of human existence. Only a true God could demand complete obedience in the area of sexual behavior, while traditional gods might govern the weather, war, or harvests. The theoretical underpinnings of these practices are remarkably complex, as evidenced by his recorded discussions with palace philosophers. An emperor who could force people to forego their most fundamental moral inhibitions had attained a degree of authority that went beyond simple political power and into the domain of divine command. According to Caligula, who reportedly saw sexual dominance as the pinnacle of political control, in addition to the humiliation of forced participation, the emperor frequently demanded large sums of money to finance his increasingly complex sexual exhibitions. The cost of building specialized venues, buying exotic props and costumes, and caring for the emperor's expanding collection of slaves and animals used in his performances left families bankrupt. The construction of a temporary amphitheatre in the gardens of the emperor's villa, where his daughter was forced to engage in sexual acts with professional gladiators, while Caligula and a few other guests watched from specially constructed viewing platforms, was documented by Senator Gaius Scribonius Curio as costing the equivalent of several years' income for a single evening's entertainment, strengthened the psychological control that sexual humiliation provided, a psychological profile that would be recognized by contemporary observers as excessive. Neurological problems is suggested by the emperor's seeming immunity to social criticism or humiliation. He may have had organic brain malfunction, which could have contributed to his increasingly unpredictable and severe behaviors, as seen by his documented seizures and claims of visual and auditory hallucinations. But given the methodical character of his abuses and the advanced psychological strategies he used, it seems unlikely that mental illness alone can explain the entirety of his behavior. Caligula showed exceptional inventiveness in creating novel kinds of humiliation and control, had consistent behavioral patterns across situations, and revealed a thorough comprehension of cause and consequence. Even though his actions were severe, they made sense and were motivated by particular political and psychological objectives. Desperate moments culminated in the plot that ultimately brought an end to Caligula's rule in 41 AD, the conspiracies. Leader Cassius Chera subsequently stated in court that the psychological difficulties of continuing to serve an emperor whose private actions had grown unbearable to witness, rather than political disagreement, was the main driving force for the assassination. The last attack took place in a small subterranean passageway that connected Thet Heater and the imperial palace. This particular location was chosen because it would enable the conspirators to murder Caligula away from the witnesses who had grown to be essential to his sense of security and authority, who had watched him for months perform actions they thought were so abhorrent that they would rather die than serve him any longer. The conspirators took the odd choice, evidently realizing that the emperor's private rights had produced a taint that was not to be contained but had to be eradicated, was seen by his contemporaries as a serious threat to Roman civilization as a whole, beyond their direct influence on Roman politics. Caligula's private rights have left a lasting historical imprint, turning close bonds into displays of control and dominance rather than pleasure and connection. The emperor's actions showed that, then love and reproduction, when societal and legal restrictions are totally lifted, who point out that political rivals and later historians might have exaggerated his excesses for propaganda. But given the regularity of tales from several different sources and the thoroughness of many of them, it appears that the basic contours of his private rights are historically correct. Even though certain details may have been exaggerated over time, the combination of unrestricted power and social isolation regularly results in similar patterns of sexual exploitation and psychological cruelty, from political leaders to military commanders to corporate executives. This suggests that Caligula's example reveals fundamental truths about human nature under extreme conditions, rather than just documenting the unique pathology of one disturbed individual. Tourists and academics stroll through marble hallways where screams and tears once reverberated as dawn breaks over the ruins of Caligula's palace complex, most of them oblivious to the personal atrocities that turned these exquisite settings into terrible theaters. The emperor, who insisted on being worshipped as a living deity, passed away alone and forgotten. However, wherever power corrupts completely and human dignity is subordinated to political authority and personal desire, the psychological patterns he embodied continue to manifest. The ghost of unlimited power continues to whisper its eternal promise in the shadows, between marble columns and in the quiet that follows hushed prayers. Individuals who have the authority to decide someone else's life or death will unavoidably develop cravings that are beyond the bounds of morality. If you enjoyed this journey through history, make sure to subscribe to History Nest, where every night a new story.